So it might seem like I've been beating around the bush all this time, but it is finally time to do some serious filmic business. The boring theoretical stuff is somewhat done, and now it is time to have some fun with these diasporic films, actually analyzing their aesthetics and styles and eventually filmically demonstrating the conceptualizations from the past 2 episodes. In order to filmically exemplify what all these conceptualizations about diasporas and diasporic films mean, we will take a closer look at Armenian Diasporic films, specifically Armenian-Canadian Atom Egoyan's, who was the guy in this previous episode by the way, Calendar, and Purya Haidari's Apricot Groves. This episode will be split into 2 parts. The first part will be an in-depth textual analysis of Egoyan's Calendar, as it will dissect his works that explicitly focus on the negotiations that take place within the Armenian diasporic identity. The second part will be an in-depth analysis of the more contemporary Armenian diasporic film, Apricot Groves, which revolves around cultural identity, gender identity, and their intersections. It is important to note that the conceptualizations taken may seem like it essentializes diasporas, but different communities within one specific diaspora also differ based on their interactions with the host land. This is the case with Armenian diasporas and their respective films. The Armenian diaspora is heterogeneous. There are many different Armenian diasporas that attribute different meanings to the homeland and their Armenianness, and this will be explored through these audiovisual essays. Therefore, Armenian diasporic cinema will be taken as a case study to exemplify how diasporic films can lie in an in-between space, how they can negotiate identity, and how they can manifest their transformational potential. So, in this episode, we will explore how Egoyan filmically juxtaposes different ways of experiencing and feeling Armenianness through the cinematography, internally focalized objective shot and long shot, and mise en scène, staging in depth and off-screen space in his 1993 film, Calendar. So, to begin with, some context. The Armenian diaspora was primarily formed by the Armenian genocide, as many Armenians dispersed across the globe to escape persecution, some of them being Atom Egoyan's grandparents. Some of them moved to the Levant, some to Europe, and some to North America, such as Egoyan's parents. Eventually, due to the lack of recognition of the genocide from the international community and Turkey, Armenians strongly maintained their cultural identity across generations. However, due to the wide range of geographical and cultural dispersion and post-modern structures of identity construction, Armenians in different diasporas experience Armenianness differently in present day. They are shaped differently over the generations depending on where they settle. Based on this, their artistic expression of identity differs, which is interesting as it demonstrates identity in flux and becoming. It is also interesting as it showcases how the diasporic identity can be negotiated and articulated not only with the major community, but also within different diasporic communities themselves. The Armenian diasporic film, especially Egoyan's and diasporic films in general, therefore are at the forefront of these discourses and can take them to a further level. So how does Egoyan as a Canadian Armenian do it? To start off, Calendar features 3 main protagonists: a photographer, played by Atom Egoyan himself, a translator, who is the photographer's wife in the film, played by Arsene Khanjan, and the guide, Driver, played by Ashot Adamyan. The photographer and his wife, who are from the Western Armenian diaspora, meaning the diaspora that migrated to the West due to the Armenian genocide, travel to Armenia to take pictures of Armenian churches and temples for a commissioned calendar. As the narrative unravels, the translator and the photographer's relationship deteriorates due to the increasingly intimate relationship the translator has with the driver. This causes the photographer and the translator to end their relationship. However, throughout the film, she is still partially attached to her husband as she sends him voicemail. The photographer is also partially attached to her as he then hires several women to speak a foreign language on the phone in his Toronto apartment. He eavesdrops on them as a means to remember his separated wife, and subsequently writes a letter to her. This is the film's premise in a nutshell, but how is the story filmically represented? Most of the scenes that involve taking photos of the Armenian churches and temples in the film are internally focalized objective point of view shots, as the shots are from the perspective of the photographer's camera and thus his viewpoint. These internally focalized objective shots feature centralized long shots of the Armenian churches and temples with the Armenian highlands in the background. In the foreground, Egoyan places the driver, who also acts as a guide that explains the history of the churches and temples in Armenian, and his wife, the translator, who translates the information from Armenian to English to the photographer. Egoyan is placed behind the camera and is not visible on the screen. There are thus certain layers due to the positioning of characters in the churches within these shots that correspond to differences within the Armenian and Western Armenian diasporic identity. For Ashot, who is an Armenian living in Armenia that probably feels a strong connection towards Armenia just after the establishment of the Armenian nation, these churches and temples that signify the homeland are closest to him. He feels the most connected to these signifiers of the Armenian homeland and construes them as elements that construct his Armenian identity. He is usually placed closest to these churches and temples, farthest away from the camera. For him, these signifiers aren't necessarily symbolic constructs, but are naturally occurring signifiers. Thus, the driver represents the full-fledged and native Armenian who knows the history of these churches and temples by heart. He represents the one whose identity is strictly defined within the confines of nationhood. He is closest to the pure essence of Armenianness, in this case to churches and temples, both physically and metaphorically, and thus he constitutes the first layer of being closest to pure Armenianness. To put it in another way, his identity is static and fixed, as his identity is merely Armenian. There isn't much space for his identity to fluctuate. His identity is absolute and unadulterated, not mixed with anything else. Okay, let's put her back in there. The translator, who stands closer to the camera, represents the second layer of the Armenian identity. She does speak Armenian and is highly intrigued by the history of her homeland. By being drawn to the two men, being a translator, and being bilingual and accented, she's literally and figuratively in between the space of the driver and the photographer. She's in a state of limbo throughout the film, where on the one hand, she wants to immerse herself in the nativist tradition, and on the other hand, she's still attached to her husband. Even the fact that her role as a translator and interpreter bridges the gap between two extreme positions within the Armenian identity. The driver who represents the pure Armenian and the photographer who represents the pseudo-Armenian. She herself talks Western Armenian, which is the language spoken by the Armenians in the Western diaspora. Through her accent and bilingualism, which primarily marks her as a diasporian, she is also in between the two ultimate positions of the Armenian identity, in between the driver who has a native accent and the photographer who does not speak any Armenian at all. She acts as an intermediator between the two, articulating their positions and differences due to her bilingualism. For example, in this scene where the driver asks the photographer if it has never occurred to him to touch and caress the churches, the photographer indulges in a satirical laugh and deems the driver's statement as meaningless.
Don't you feel the need to come closer? Feel, like actually touch and feel?
Touch and feel
Realize
the churches?
how it's made, constructed?
To touch and feel the churches.
Yeah?
Hasn't occurred to me.
Hasn't occurred to you?
No.
Departing from these differences, the homeland for the translator is not a commodified object or a means to make money, which is how the photographer perceives it, but is an actualization of a heritage she never got to realistically experience. Arsine represents the Western Armenian Diasporic subject, who is still deeply rooted within the Armenian tradition. The meaning of the homeland for Arsine lies within these symbolic spaces that are actualized and realized. They do not remain in the imaginary realm of desire, but she engages and even touches her heritage, and therefore comes closer to it. She represents the Western Armenian Diasporian, who speaks both Armenian and English and aspires to return to the idyllic homeland and Heimat, where utopian imagination becomes realistic objectivity. The last layer that remains is that is occupied by the photographer, who is foreignified to the whole space. Although not visually present in the frame, his presence is felt due to his audible voice coming from off-screen space. This positioning would understand him as a distant Western Armenian diasporian whose homeland is constructed through the process of mediation, photography. This is accentuated when, at one point, he interrupts the translator and asks the driver and her to move out of the frame to make the perfect shot. This signifies that it is merely the photograph that is of uttermost importance to him, in terms of the project and the construction of his version of the homeland. He doesn't want to hear the historical narratives as it might contaminate his version of the homeland. He makes them leave as they distort his conception of the homeland. Thus, the primary focus on the photograph as a static freeze frame is meant to draw one into aesthetic contemplation. What these churches and temples just mean to him is their beauty, as he says,
I think that they were very, very beautiful places.
They remain within the realm of the image, within the realm of the imaginary. He is removed and unacknowledged by the physical space and vice versa. It just exists and is reproduced through the image. These cultural and religious symbols were never actually actualized for the photographer, as he remains and watches from a distance. The homeland for the photographer is thus attributed meaning by remaining somewhat foreign, a figurative fetish. This is the only way to keep the homeland in the realm of desire, by keeping it at a distance. This is precisely why he constructs condensed versions of the homeland, as he deems it as tactilely undesirable. As Nafisi puts it, only when the ground return to the homeland is found to be impossible, illusory, or undesirable does the postmodernist semiosis set in. Then the nostalgia of the referent and the pain of separation from it may be transformed into a nostalgia for its synecdoches, fetishes, and signifieds, the frozen sounds and images of the homeland, which are then circulated in exilic media and pop culture. However, the homeland does not always stay within the realm of the image throughout the film. The photographer at one point does get closer to his homeland, both physically and spiritually. Remember when he was asked if he ever has the urge to touch the churches? So yeah, after that, he is seen pointing to the facade of one of the churches, but he doesn't physically touch it. Again, he just comes closer to it from a distance. He thus attempts to reenact the spirituality that the driver possesses, but still remains aloof, just like in the rest of the similar scenes. The photographer's character thus becomes somewhat partially transformed as he integrates a trace of the nativist driver into his actions. This once again manifests the flexibility of the diasporic identity, where the subject is able to construct certain parts of their identity and even come to deconstruct it. The photographer brings himself closer to the other Armenian positions, but he might also distance himself at any other time and position himself elsewhere. This notion is furthered in the film as the staging in depth is not only constituted by the wide-angle long shot of the Armenian highlands, but also through the dialogue that the photographer partakes in with and through his wife, in which he also gains access to the driver. The off-screen space and sound helps position the photographer behind the camera, and they are significant as they technically accentuate on the distance he possesses to the pure Armenianness. At points, the viewer is not even aware that the photographer is within the filmic space, but the conversations that take place between the characters notify the viewer of his existence behind the space of the unfolding narrative. It can thus be said that the viewer is only conscious of the photographer's presence once he starts speaking, and once the driver and the translator look at him. What is even more uncanny, however, is that the photographer is watching the spatio-temporal narrative of the film unfold, sometimes even without any acknowledgement from the translator and the driver. He is also thus abstracted from the whole scenario. He is foreignified to the space that deems itself as Armenian. This play of the translator and the driver being aware and unaware that the photographer is present in the filmic space deems the photographer's identity as ambiguous and ambivalent. The photographer is part of the Armenian identity and vice versa, but at the same time, he is not. This is exemplified when the photographer, when reciting the letter he has written to Arsene, says,
"We're both from here, yet being here has made me from somewhere else."
It is only his ghost and shadow that are present, signifying only minute traces of an Armenian identity that exists within him. He is only imaginarily present within the Armenian spaces for the viewer, as his existence in these spaces never becomes concretized in the sense that he is never visually shown. The viewer only gets to see him once he is back at its house in, presumably, Toronto. He belongs to that space, but he also does somewhat belong to the Armenian space, just off-screen, not on-screen, but in the filmic world, in between Toronto and Armenia, in between the viewer and the film. He occupies two spaces at the same time. The photographer's voice thus brings off-screen space into play. He is positioned in between the on-screen and the off-screen as he is visually off-screen but orally on-screen. Off-screen space is thus negotiated with his voice, which makes the viewer understand that he is in the filmic world. He's in a space where the viewer can hear a voice without a body, a disembodied figure. There is no embodied spiritual conviction and experience for the photographer. His position and existence in these shots are thus negotiated due to the off-screen space and the staging in depth employed by Egoyan. Although the photographer, the driver, and the translator are spatially distant and distinguished, Egoyan places and merges these three different positions within a spatio-temporal whole, the film. Henceforth, the film presents the third space of Armenianness, where each subject constitutes the homeland as such. This whole construction of varied layers understands the Armenian diasporic identity, Armenianness, and the Western Armenian diasporic identity as heterogeneous. It's a space where different identifications are simultaneously threaded and negotiated together. Calendar does not reveal the essence of Armenian culture or what we traditionally identify as Armenian, but it problematizes and questions what being Armenian is and how it manifests itself. Significations of the homeland are thus always in flux as characters perceive, craft, and shape cultural signs differently. The deep staging on the one hand accentuates on these differences and on the other harmonizes them. This exemplifies how film can become a negotiable space where identities are constructed, reconstructed, and deconstructed vis-a-vis diasporic cinema. The Armenian homeland thus becomes a heterotopia, where identities and differences within the Armenian diasporic subject are reconciled and exist within multifaceted and varied spatio-temporal realms. There isn't one utopian imaginary homeland, but what the real actually encompasses is the heterotopic filmic space in which, as Michel Foucault puts it, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted.